I'm super excited to be here with you. I, of course, wish that we could be in the same room, but Give, Dan, and Sarah have been pretty amazing. And I think that this community always feels very close. So I almost feel like as if I were in the same room with you. Today, what I thought we could talk about is how to build products for non-average users, and at the same time, how to think about building diverse and non-average teams. So for that, what I can do is tell you a little bit more about myself. And as Sarah mentioned, I grew up in Mexico. And two things that I now realize that really shape how I think about products and teams came from two things. A, you heard about being a TV reporter. And as I had to tell the stories of athletes and academics and so on such a regular basis, I had to very quickly connect with people and then think about how to tell their story. So that became fundamental. As you know, in product is really all about people's problems, and then also figuring out how to build product teams that work well together. And then the second thing is ice skating. I put one photo of me on my butt. And the reason I did that was because basically, if you guys know a little bit about ice skating, is that you have like seconds in the air where every single part of your body needs to be adjusting so that in one moment, like the jump happens and that you can actually land it. And that's actually what taught me that to reach a goal, whether it's like, you know, winning a national champion, you cannot get there unless you're doing fine tuning every single day of many different things. And that's actually how I think about product optimization, as a system of many different levers, like almost like all the parts of the body that you need to change until at one point they're actually working really well together and you have a system that works. So here's actually then what happened in my career. As Sarah mentioned, actually she didn't say that. I wanted to be a diplomat, but then I was like, no, this is like too crazy. I'm gonna do kind of like the business side of it. So my very first job, I studied college and my first master's in France. And then I went to work for a supply chain company in Germany. And my job was like to optimize supply chains. That's the first image on the left, where basically we were thinking about how to make goods go from one location to the other in the fastest way and the most effective way. And little did I know that when I started working at Zynga, as an example, like the optimization of flows was very similar to what we do in product. As Sarah mentioned, I also worked in consulting, so I had to do a lot of analytics. And then I joined companies that even back in the day, as an example, I worked at Facebook already 10 years ago. We were amassing big amounts of data, and Zynga was too. And that's when I realized that product was really both the art of what we're doing, but also the science of that optimization of flows. So on the people side, I was lucky to join companies where we had a bunch of user data. And I'm going to use a bunch of examples from OkCupid because you could almost like get into the psyche of people and how do they really think given all of the information we had, not just about who our users were, but also the questions that they were answering, how they would view the world. So a few of the companies that I worked at were Meetup as a director of product, OkCupid as we took the company public, then Intuit. At Intuit, I had two roles. One of them was managing a very large org and a large P&L. Then I did international expansion. And as Sarah mentioned, now I'm working on several strategic initiatives at Facebook. I'm going to talk about racial justice. So with that, let's start about how do we build products. I'm going to give you two examples. One of them, when we think about diverse people or building for non-average users, we often quickly go to race and sexual orientation and other things like that. But I want to prove you that when you actually need to think about non-average users, you can actually think about the most stereotypical person ever. So let's start with that example. OkCupid. So at OkCupid, you know that we gather a lot of data for our users. And what is really interesting is that we can see how people interact with one another. So as an example, if you would take a user, say an average gender, like a male, race, white, age 25, even for that person, they will be seen by other people in many different ways. Like this person could be average, but some person might find them super attractive, or very little attractive. And what was super interesting is that regardless of the person themselves, if the same person, say Joe Joe Doe, would move from New York City to Florida, Joe Doe's popularity ranking could increase because it turns out that everything worked in terms of the ecosystem where you were. If you were in a place like New York City where you had many options, actually the average rate of Joe would be much lower than if he moved to a place where there were less guys. So that was what was really interesting when we started thinking about how do people view one another and what is average. So let me give you, this is basically an example of all of the data that we would get, obviously what people would give us, but also how they would interact with one another and what would that mean in terms of communications. So let's start with this example. Here we're gonna see how would guys rate straight women and how would they determine that attractiveness. So this is going to be a graph where you could say like guys think that 80% of women are more attractive or super attractive, or you could say that they think that most women are not attractive. What do you think that on average guys think that women are? Like how would you draw with your hands? How do you think the graph is going to look like? Is it going to be like all towards like super attractive or the other way around, very non-attractive? Ivana, I think, is saying like a normal distribution. Well, Ivana gets the prize because actually what was super interesting is that when we were seeing how guys think about things, it was almost mathematical perfection that guys would create a perfect, almost normal distribution. So now let's think about how women do. I already gave it away. Women, unfortunately, think that more men are less attractive. But when you put them together, basically you see that there's a place where there's the average of how attractive people are, but then there's the extremes. And what is really interesting is that that's the problem, right? We're not even talking about people that we would consider diverse because of their sexual orientation or race. It's like Joe Doe, and Joe Doe can sometimes be, he could consider himself very average, but he could actually end up rating super attractive for the circumstances or the market, or very not attractive. And in that sense, that's what I really love about product is that when we're shipping product, we always think about demographics or segments of users. But sometimes like you cannot even control where do your users lie. And in this case, imagine a dating product where you get a segment of users that get all of the messages and they're inundating with random messages. And then you get another percentage of users that are not getting any attention. That doesn't work, right? And we cannot just have a product that only works for the middle. So that's what I want to talk to you about as an example of some of the data stuff that we did to try to cover all of the spectrum of users and what does that mean in terms of how you can develop your products. So a little bit about geekiness stuff that I love. This is a product that basically, a book that changed my life, Record the Name. It's about system dynamics. And I don't know if that's like how my brain is wired, but what I love is that many times we often think like there's an action and there's a reaction. But this book opened my mind to thinking about all of the secondary effects that an action and reaction has. And this book actually talks about fairly complex views of the world or competitors and so on, because basically what you see is that if you had an action and a reaction, that affects your competitors and how the news think about it and how your users think about things. So what I love about this perspective is that whenever we're building about product, many times we're so zoomed into the specific flows of our users that then we don't think about the macro picture of how our product works. So very quickly, I'll tell you like two key things about this book. One of them is that you have virtuous circles. In this case, if there's more chickens, there's more eggs. If there's more eggs, there's more chickens. You get it? That basically there's something that is happening that it's making something even bigger. And then you get other types of flows where it's the opposite. The more road crossings, the less chickens, well, it's not less road crossings, but you basically get that the more road crossings, the less chickens there will be. So there's basically a circle that diminishes the outcome of stuff. And what I did was for OkCupid, we basically created an ecosystem of what were the most important pillars or system of our product and what would people interact with. We actually had a huge problem of retention where we would get people come in and then basically not show up 7 days later. And when we started thinking about how all of the things come together, we basically found that there was one thing that made a big change for our ecosystem, and that was people answering questions. Because if you think about it, if you answer questions, now your matching percentage actually can increase with people. So now more people see you with a higher percentage when we present them to you. And now you message those people that you're like, they went from 0 match percentage because we had no data to an 85 or a 95 and so on. So again, we don't need to go into the super detail of this view, but it's important that you see, how to think in a very big picture, not just about the specific onboarding flows, but how the different ecosystem or pillars in a product are connected and the cycles that then they represent in terms of interaction. So what we did was we took a very old system of questions that we had actually very hidden in the product. And we won't go into the details, but we had a lot of details about how do you want the other person to answer and so on. It was complex. And we changed it into swiping yes or no, and basically knowing that the questions that we were going to ask were very polarizing. And we put that very early in the product, in the onboarding. And crazy thing, we actually increased retention by 21%, to the point that these slides are from Google I/O, because Google, they can see all of the numbers of onboarding and retention for their apps that they have. And then one day they called us and they were like, what the hell did you guys do? Are your analytics wrong, or you really did something that changed things? So then they asked us to present at Google I/O, because we had actually been able to really significantly change the retention of our users. So now if we think about when we were talking about the example of people that were at the edges, this is an example of something that we launched that was pretty fun. And it turns out that most users, I'm guessing many of you have used Tinder. Let's see, raise hands. If you have ever used Tinder, raise your hands. You guys have never used Tinder? Or did my computer freeze? I actually see a slow connection.
I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand.
Okay, it seems that we have a population. It seems that we have a population that hasn't used as much online dating. But anyway, with basically Tinder, you would swipe, and with OkCupid, it was very similar. And you could actually swipe, and then we would have sessions of people that were just like basically swiping left, which means not liking people, for like a lot of users. So you had the contrary, where a lot of people were just swiping right. But the problem is that we had people that would never show up because they were kind of at the edges of what people would find interesting. So what we did was we created these products that we called flavors. And what we did was, remember the questions? We could actually gather information about what did people care about. So for instance, we had hardcore cuddlers. Those were people that we knew that they had tattoos because they had told us, but we also knew that they were very softy and that they like cuddling or things like that. Or we, for instance, had packages of women who love people with beards and men that had beards and things like that. So basically we created this game where we would show you 10 people, and then you would basically have to like someone. And what was really interesting is that in that set, when we would just show you one set per day, the chances of people actually liking others were much higher. They were like on average like 3 people over 10, which was much higher than a lot of the type of behavior that we had before that was like 0 people over 10. And what was pretty cool is because we were creating this odd sets of people that otherwise would not have been seen, we actually were able to cover much more the extremes and therefore give more distribution and visibility to people that were not showing up. So that obviously alleviated the problem of people that were getting a lot of messages, but also allowed to have more visibility for users that wouldn't show up and now started having likes and hence conversations. So that was a very quick way to talk about A, system dynamics, and B, how anyone, a lot of us even, could end up being on average even without us knowing. Let me stop there. All good? Shall I move to the next one? Yeah, okay. So now let's talk about really actually now creating products for non-average users. One thing is that when we were going to the IPO with OkCupid, it turns out that we only had 2 genders, male and female, and we had 3 orientations. You could either be straight or gay or bisexual. And I am queer, and we had a lot of employees in the company that were queer too, and we're saying like, this is impossible. Like, you cannot have a product that it's about bringing and finding you the love of your life if you cannot even describe yourself who you are, or you want to like be specific about the person that you want to be your life partner. And I felt super contradicted because on the one hand, I knew where we're going towards the IPO. So on the one hand, I needed to make sure that we were delivering on all of the growth numbers and revenue numbers. And it seemed like this was going to be an impossible problem. You want me to tell you why? Because it turns out that how we had coded OkCupid was zeros and ones. If you were not a guy, that was a 0, else you were a woman. So we had like no place in the code to actually have non-binary genders. So what we did was basically start brainstorming with a very diverse team to say, well, how can we fix this? It doesn't seem right that we're actually continuing to have people not be able to express who they are. And it's actually creating a product that feels very incorrect, because then people go to dates and they basically need to explain whether they are gender fluid or they have a sexual orientation that we couldn't actually map, even talking about both monogamous versus polygamous relationships. So it turns out that we find a way where we could hack our system. And in just about 4 months, we were able to launch 22 genders and 13 orientations, which actually then allowed us to create a better product. Because we didn't need to make a distinction, right, between just 2 genders, there's many more, and just 3 orientations, there's many more. And also then we started getting a lot of positive feedback from our users that were saying it was super complex, say that they had a fluid gender, that then they would have to go to a date and explain that, versus actually just putting that up front in their profile. And then the people that they were matching, they were actually wanted people just like them, and they could have more accurate dates. So that's an example of something that we did, where at first it felt like the situation was impossible, but with a very diverse team, we were able to find the workaround. And in fact, something that was pretty fun was that we didn't need to even find definitions for all of the genders or sexual orientations. What we did was that we created a site where we asked people to say, like, what does being queer mean to you? What does gender fluid mean to you? And when people actually had questions in our product, they would click, and then they would go to this website that was actually filled in with how users themselves would describe their own sexual orientation. And that was pretty cool, because there isn't just one description that matches a sexual orientation or a gender. So that was pretty fun in terms of how we could bring in a very diverse set of users that would actually tell us how to best explain something as complex as gender and sexual orientation. And that all came because we had a very diverse set of product managers and designers that could actually understand that those subjects, they don't have basically a binary answer of this is the definition, and we could just bring the population and the users, the right communities together. So let me see how we're doing with time. I'll be very quick about this new thing that we're working on at Facebook, that is racial justice. There's many ways in which we can talk about racial justice. We have used the definition by ACLU that chooses us to view what are the reasons why what the root cause for oppression, and then also how to solve it. And this is actually a framework that was pretty helpful for us. You can also find it at ACLU, which are the buckets of categories when you are working on anything related to racial justice that you can use. So we started first from understanding what would be a good framework for racial justice. And then as we're doing product prioritization, we're using that framework to say, well, what are the areas that we want to improve? And as an example, we recently launched Leave Black Voices, which was a product to showcase much more about our Black users and their experience. So we had Black photographers, Black journalists, and so on, so that people would not hear about Black experiences from a white perspective, but from people that could basically best talk about what Juneteenth mean to them, or even most recently, the March on Washington. Another thing that we started doing was also offering support for Black-owned businesses. But here's something really interesting. If you guys are thinking about developing products for race, sometimes you don't know people's race, right? So here, what we had to do was like figure out what flows could we create so that business owners could self-identify either by race or minority, veterans, and so on. And then we could show that information in a way that now we had supply of the different categories of businesses that we have in the platform, and then create demand on the other side where we could say, here are Black businesses that are close to you and so on. And finally, something that is super important as we are working with diverse set of people is that sometimes they don't have opportunities or they don't have the right network. So when we were thinking about how to showcase even much more Black creators, we realized that we didn't have many, and that sometimes we would have created scholarships or incentives, but then they would create an increase in popularity and then decrease. So what we did this time around was basically give them all of the tools that the most successful artists would have, where we created the scholarship, we brought in 100 creators, and now we're teaching them how to create an organic and sustained a population of followers in a way that we're basically giving them access to things that before you needed to know friends in the industry so that you could have access to that information. So that leads me to the last point before we go into Q&A, which is we need to focus on how to build more inclusive products and product teams. Let me very briefly tell you about how do I think about making product teams more diverse. We have interviewed a lot of underrepresented people, basically Black employees, Latino employees, Indigenous employees, and asked them, are you interested in product? Most of the times, there's a big subset of people that are actually interested in product. In fact, we often seen, and that might happen in your companies, that you have more underrepresented people in jobs like operations, in jobs like marketing or HR on others, more so than in product, right? But the problem is that they don't know how to get into product careers. So here, two examples is that we have a lot of people that are close to product teams, but they're not product people and they want to get there. And also these underrepresented minorities are very interested not just in their product careers, but also solving real customer problems and making better products, which is really fun about the motivation that underrepresented people have on joining product teams versus just talking about career advancement. However, if you see now on the right-hand side, one of the biggest hurdles is not having exposure, not knowing how to get to a product job, like what are the key skills, how to get them, and not having people that support them. So here's actually something that I started putting together for us building more diverse products. Basically, this pyramid summarizes what are some of the, that's actually the wrong one, give me a second. I jumped one. Here we are. This pyramid talks about the 3 biggest hurdles that underrepresented people have to join product teams. Number 1 is getting started. You might already have a bunch of people in your company that are excited about product, but they just don't have the network where they have a friend that already works in product and can give them some of the tips of what type of skills do they have and how to go through the interviews. In many cases, I also actually jumped from a career that was not in product to product, but I did it because I had more peers that were already product managers that gave me mock interviews and that were allowed me to have that first opportunity. The second problem that underrepresented minorities often have, it's actually in becoming a manager. And let me give you a very important tip. Many times we talk about the opportunities are there and we don't understand why underrepresented people are not applying to those jobs. The reason is that there's often a problem related to self-confidence, but also please be very mindful that many times underrepresented people actually have to support financially their families. Many times underrepresented minorities have systems of families that live together where they will support the grandparents or other people in the family. And therefore, getting to a bigger job, becoming a manager, means that there's an element of risk that they cannot take. Because yes, if it works, they might have chances to then grow their careers. But if it doesn't, that means that they might actually lose their job and they cannot take that risk because of the people that they support. Finally, becoming an executive. That's another one of the big hurdles that underrepresented people have. And that is because oftentimes when we think about the stereotype of the executive, There's just one way in which to communicate or to be an executive. So when you see less people that look like you, not only does that mean that there's going to be more uncertainty, but even the biases that we have to say, does that person have executive presence or not? They might be unconscious. And that might mean that you might actually think that the person doesn't have the communication skills when it actually might be that the person communicates with a different style. So basically, what we are doing right now at Facebook was one, and this could be good things that perhaps could inspire you to do something in your company, is that I put together a group of 6 PMs, 2 working on each initiative. One that it's called Democratize Information. We're basically putting together the list of documents and Medium articles and so on about what it means to be a product manager and tips on how to prepare for each one of the interviews that we have. Second, we're making coffee chats where we're bringing people from many different backgrounds, marketing, operations, people that from different races, so that they can see themselves and they can see that it can work out. And finally, we're also creating mock interviews so that we can create a safe space where underrepresented people can go into that interview, get feedback, and not miss the chance of being a PM just because they don't have the shared language like A/B testing. They could be great in analytics, but they don't know what A/B testing is. Second, we're also working on quarterships. That's where we bring someone on board for a quarter and we teach them what it means to be a PM. We don't offer them the PM job. They still need to go through the interviews, but we believe that by having that experience, they have more chances of going successfully through the interview. And finally, the last thing that we're working on, it's called allyship chain, which basically means that an executive supports a director a manager, a high-level individual contributor. So basically, all that I need to do is support one person and ask that person to support someone else. And that way, you're basically creating that chain of change where you're most likely going to be able to give feedback to the person right below because you just did the things that that person has questions about. So that's some of the things that we're right now implementing at the company. So with that, we got to the end of the meeting. Why don't I stop there? Obviously, please take a photo of this to get some feedback. And if we have time, perhaps we can do some Q&A.
Yeah. So Jimena, you're getting incredible feedback in the chat. And we wanted to start with a question that Jamie Sterling asked toward, if you're ready, Jamie.
Sure. Hi. Yes, my question, it does not have anything really to do with non-average users when it comes to diversity and inclusion, but more when you're a startup or a smaller or growing company, it seems wise often strategically to focus in on your most primary use cases, and you often don't have the ability to invest in the non-average users or your rare use cases, essentially. So at what point does that really become a part of your company strategy, or do you have any kind of rebuff for that, challenge I think I see in the smaller companies here?
Yeah, I totally get you, because actually at OkCupid, we were less than 100 people. And on top of that example of going towards the IPO, it was a matter of life or death almost. But I think that, as product managers, we always need to have a portfolio of things that are about innovation, our bread and butter, and things where we clean things up. And I think that also product needs to represent the ethos and culture of the company. In this case, for me, as a queer leader that had queer employees, I could not just be like, not my problem. And sometimes I talk about this moment, almost like the Matrix thing, where do I take the blue pill or the red pill? What type of leader am I? And I really felt that it was up to me to live up to my values in terms of what do I stand for, because we not only build products for monetization success, we build them so they're good for our users. We build them so that we build also healthy teams. So I think that as we're thinking almost about leadership, there's moments where our own diversity, we all have different shapes and forms of what it means to be diverse. That's where we can bring a perspective that it's very different, and would allow us to then show who we are as leaders. In this case, we could do a hack. It was not perfect, but we could launch it. And actually it brought the employees on board because they saw that we were not just a company that was in for the monetization and the IPO, but also for the values of our employees and our users.
100%. Thank you.
Kintan, there was a question from you, if you can unmute.
Sure. Hey, Jimena, how are you? I had a question on goals. Do you guys have goals for representation in hiring? To say, hey, we'll have at least X% of candidates from a certain background when hiring a certain role, and if so, do you have goals across all levels, or do you just have goals, say, for leadership roles or roles above a certain level? Because I've been debating that question myself, and want to see if there's a mechanism we can build around it.
Yep. So I recently joined Facebook, so I cannot tell you exactly how it works because I'm actually not aware. I do know that for, I think, manager up levels, we definitely need to have interviewed diverse candidates. I don't know if that is also for individual contributor roles, but that is something that I think that in many cases, it's great if you have a company policy around it, but otherwise as a leader yourself or as product managers ourselves, it's like, sometimes if I'm interviewing for my team, I'm like, I'm not going to make a decision unless I have interviewed enough women and people of color. And sure, like I do have an incentive to hire fast, but I also have a super good incentive to hire well. And I know that the more diverse people I bring in, the more diverse are going to be my teams. And many times, actually, other people ask me, how come your teams are super diverse? Like we have a lot of races and sexual orientations. Right now, for one of the initiatives I'm working in, we have, I think, the highest ratio of women leaders in that group. And I think the reason is that once you create diversity, diversity comes. So that is why as product leaders, instead of only thinking about, do we have a ratio, it's that it's actually on our self-interest to start thinking more broadly and be more patient to find the right candidates.
Thank you.
And we have one last question, Ivana. She is ready.
1 second.
Ivana, who won the graph challenge.
Yes.
I wish I had the opportunity to do the women one. I would have gotten it spot on as well. First of all, you are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I was just about to type this. I'm just so grateful for you as a queer founder, minority founder. I'm so inspired. The question that I had was, as a product leader, how do you know, what are the telltale signs that you have an unaverage user problem?
That I have an on-average user sign. So we can see it actually even on engagement. I think that it's all about system dynamics, right? Like you can see things as a average, right? Is engagement growing or not? But I think it takes some foresight to think about, well, let's cut the population by different types, like new users, old users, by gender, by areas in the world. And that's where you can start seeing that perhaps not all of the segments are growing as well. And that's when you can start realizing where are the areas of opportunity or contraction of the network. Because any system needs to have all of the pieces together so that it's actually working well. And I often talk about it almost like a human body. You have your respiratory system, the digestive system, and so on. So you have all of these ecosystems of people working. And sometimes the machine is working, our body is working, but it turns out that we start getting sick in one of our systems. So I think that that's the part, as an example, even as we were talking about Black creators, there's so much culture that is created by Black creators, but if we're not supporting them well, where they come in and they don't have the level of support and supporters that is sustainable, then that actually decreases. So I think that's the importance of just doing a bit more foresight, not just in analyzing the average user, but cut it in different ways. And then you'll start getting a diagnosis or perhaps one area of your system that is starting to decline and that you need to pay attention, because not only is that part sick, but sometimes the sickness can spread.
That's fantastic. Do you mind if I expand on that with just a small extension? How do you make sure that you don't mistake that from for an area that you have product market fit in versus not?
So how do you not mistake it for an area that you don't have product market fit? Well, the question is that then population key for you to gain product market fit with? As an example, Facebook is a product that in theory works for everyone. Yeah. But at the same time, we're starting to see how around the world and around different age cohorts, racial cohorts, it needs to be broader than just saying roughly 3 billion people use it. So then the question is, is it because, as an example, I'm just going to make something up, people in Timbuktu are not using Facebook, that's a problem, or it's not? I think that if that is a reflection of something that could be a big opportunity or a big challenge, then you're like, well, how the hell am I going to get actually product market fit? Because yes, we cannot prioritize everything, but I think it's all about making choices where unless you decided that that's not a problem, then you haven't yet decided if that's an opportunity you should tackle or not.